September 14, 1943. 28,000 feet above the North Sea. Flight Lieutenant James Edgar Johnson banked his Supermarine Spitfire Mark 9 into a climbing turn that should have been impossible. Through his gun sight, a German Dornier Do-217 bomber grew larger in his reflector sight, its twin engines trailing black smoke as it struggled toward the safety of occupied Europe. What Johnson was about to attempt violated every rule of fighter engagement written in the Royal Air Force Fighter Command Tactical Manual. Head-on attacks against multi-engine bombers were explicitly forbidden. The approach angle was too steep, the closure rate too high, the window for accurate gunfire too narrow. Yet in the next 15 seconds, Johnson would execute a maneuver that would transform how British fighters engaged German bombers for the remainder of the war. 8 machine guns roared for 3 seconds. 240 rounds of .303 caliber ammunition converged on the Dornier's nose section. The bomber's port engine exploded. The aircraft rolled inverted and began its final dive toward the gray waters below. Johnson had achieved his 34th confirmed victory using a method that Fighter Command had declared suicidal. This was the culmination of a tactical revolution that began 18 months earlier when a young pilot from Leicestershire decided that the manual was wrong. The story of how James Edgar Johnson became the highest-scoring British fighter pilot of World War II doesn't begin with aerial combat. It begins with rejection, physical limitation, and a flying culture that prioritized formation discipline over individual initiative. To understand why Johnson's head-on attack represented such a radical departure from accepted practice, you must first understand what British fighter pilots were trained to do in 1940, and why those methods proved inadequate when facing the realities of aerial warfare over Europe. In 1939, when war erupted across Europe, Royal Air Force fighter doctrine emphasized disciplined formation attacks against enemy bombers. The prescribed method involved approaching bomber formations from behind and below, where defensive fire was theoretically lighter. Fighter pilots flew in tight formations called VICs, 3 aircraft arranged in a V shape that looked impressive during peacetime reviews but proved fatally rigid during combat. The standard fighter command attack was called the number 1 attack. 12 fighters would approach a bomber formation in 4 VICs of 3 aircraft each. On command from the formation leader, all 12 fighters would execute a coordinated turn, line up behind individual bombers, and open fire from 600 yards. The attack prioritized formation integrity over tactical flexibility. Individual initiative was discouraged. Pilots who broke formation faced disciplinary action. Head-on attacks were explicitly prohibited in Fighter Command tactical instructions. The official reasoning was sound. Bomber and fighter approached each other at a combined closing speed, exceeding 600 miles per hour. This provided approximately 2 seconds for effective gunfire. The fighter pilot had to account for massive deflection angles while avoiding collision with a much larger aircraft. Most critically, the fighter was exposed to concentrated defensive fire from multiple gun positions as it approached head-on. James Edgar Johnson seemed an unlikely candidate to challenge Fighter Command doctrine. Born March 9, 1916 in Barrow-upon-Soar, Leicestershire, he came from a working-class family with no military connections. His father was a police constable. His mother worked as a seamstress. Johnson left school at age 14 to work as an apprentice civil engineer, studying part-time to earn his engineering qualifications. In 1938, Johnson applied to join the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, the part-time flying organization that trained civilian pilots for potential military service. The medical examination revealed a shoulder injury from a rugby match that had never properly healed. The examining doctor declared Johnson medically unfit for flying duties. Johnson was devastated. Flying had become his consuming passion. He appealed the decision and was rejected again. When war was declared in September 1939, the Royal Air Force faced a critical shortage of trained pilots. Medical standards were relaxed. Johnson reapplied and was accepted into the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve. He began flying training at RAF Sywell in Northamptonshire in February 1940, just as the German Wehrmacht was preparing for its spring offensive in Western Europe. Johnson's initial flying training followed standard Royal Air Force procedures. Student pilots learned formation, flying, aerobatics, and gunnery using obsolete aircraft like the Milesmaster trainer. Combat tactics received minimal attention. The emphasis was on producing pilots who could fly disciplined formations and follow orders precisely. Individual combat skills were considered secondary to formation cohesion. By August 1940, as the Battle of Britain reached its climax, Johnson completed advanced flying training and received his commission as a pilot officer. He was posted to No. 6 Operational Training Unit at RAF Sutton Bridge to learn fighter tactics on the Hawker Hurricane. The training syllabus still emphasized formation attacks against bomber targets. Student pilots practiced the standard fighter command approaches using camera guns to record their accuracy. Johnson excelled at formation flying but struggled with deflection shooting. His gunnery scores were mediocre. Instructors noted his tendency to close too rapidly on targets and his difficulty maintaining proper formation position during mock combat. These characteristics would later prove instrumental to his success, but at Sutton Bridge they marked him as an average pilot with discipline problems. In January 1941, Johnson received his first operational posting to No. 19 Squadron at RAF Duxford, flying the Supermarine Spitfire Mark I. No. 19 Squadron had fought throughout the Battle of Britain and lost numerous experienced pilots. Johnson joined as part of a replacement draft intended to restore the squadron to operational strength. Johnson's first combat mission occurred on February 26, 1941, a sweep over German-occupied France. Flying as No. 3 in a section of 3 aircraft, Johnson followed his section leader through a series of turns designed to search for German fighters. They encountered nothing. Johnson returned to base feeling frustrated by the passive nature of the mission. This would become a recurring theme throughout his early operational career. Throughout spring 1941, Fighter Command conducted increasingly aggressive sweeps over occupied Europe. The official objective was to force the Luftwaffe into combat and relieve pressure on other theaters. Pilots called these missions circuses. Johnson flew dozens of circus operations without firing his guns in anger. When combat occurred, it happened so quickly that formations scattered before individuals could engage effectively. Johnson's breakthrough came on June 26, 1941, during a circus operation over Saint-Omer. His section encountered a formation of Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters climbing from below. As the two formations merged, disciplined tactics dissolved into individual combat. Johnson found himself separated from his section leader, facing a lone German fighter in a turning fight. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. Johnson used superior turning ability to gain position behind the Messerschmitt. From 150 yards, he fired a 2-second burst that struck the German fighter's engine. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove toward occupied France, trailing white coolant vapor. Johnson had achieved his first victory, but more importantly, he had learned that individual combat skills mattered more than formation discipline. Over the following months, Johnson developed an aggressive fighting style that often brought him into conflict with squadron leadership. He flew closer to enemy formations than regulations specified. He pursued individual German fighters beyond the range where other squadron aircraft could provide support. Most controversially, he began experimenting with alternative attack angles against German bomber formations. The catalyst for Johnson's tactical innovation came during a bomber interception mission on August 19, 1941. Intelligence reported a German bomber formation approaching southeastern England at medium altitude. No. 19 Squadron scrambled to intercept, with Johnson flying as a section leader for the first time. The squadron located 12 Dornier Du 217 bombers approaching Canterbury at 15,000 feet. Squadron leader Brian Lane ordered a standard No. 1 attack. 3 sections of 4 aircraft would approach from behind and below, attack in sequence, and reform for additional passes. Johnson followed orders and positioned his section for the prescribed approach. As the attack developed, Johnson observed the limitations of the standard approach. German gunners in the bombers' rear positions had clear fields of fire against attacking fighters. The Spitfires had to fly predictable courses to maintain formation integrity. Several fighters sustained damage from defensive fire before achieving firing positions. Johnson's section damaged one bomber, but failed to achieve decisive results. During the reformation phase, Johnson noticed that the bomber formation had continued toward its target without significant course changes. The surviving bombers maintained tight formation, presenting a concentrated defensive fire pattern that discouraged further attacks. Squadron leader Lane ordered the squadron to return to base rather than attempt additional intercepts. That evening, Johnson analyzed the engagement in his personal combat diary. The standard rear attack had achieved minimal results against bomber formations that expected such approaches. German gunners were trained to engage fighters attacking from behind. Bomber pilots flew defensive formations designed to maximize rear-firing defensive coverage. Fighter command tactics played directly into German defensive preparations. Johnson began studying alternative approaches. Head-on attacks offered several theoretical advantages. German bombers carried minimal forward-firing armament. Bomber pilots had limited visibility directly ahead due to engine nacelles and cockpit structure. Most critically, head-on attacks disrupted bomber formations by forcing evasive maneuvers that scattered individual aircraft. The primary disadvantage was obvious. Fighter pilots had approximately 2 seconds to achieve accurate gunfire before risking collision. The approach required precise range estimation, deflection calculation, and split-second timing. Any error could result in mid-air collision or missing the target entirely. Fighter command had rejected head-on attacks as too dangerous for standard operational use. Johnson began practicing head-on approaches during training flights. Using camera guns, he practiced engaging target drogues from various angles and distances. He experimented with approach speeds, dive angles, and firing positions. Gradually, he developed a standardized technique that maximized accuracy while minimizing collision risk. The key insight was altitude advantage. By attacking from above, Johnson could dive toward the bomber formation at high speed, achieve optimal firing position, and use the dive to escape below the bombers after firing. The steep approach angle reduced exposure time to defensive fire. The high closure rate compressed the engagement window, but also reduced the bomber crew's reaction time. Johnson's first operational test of the head-on approach occurred on October 7, 1941, during an interception mission over Kent. German intelligence had identified a Royal Air Force radar station near Dover as a priority target. A formation of 8 Dornier Do 217 bombers approached at medium altitude, escorted by Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. Squadron leader Lane assigned Johnson's section to engage the bomber formation, while other sections dealt with the fighter escort. Johnson positioned his section 3,000 feet above the German formation and slightly ahead of their course. Instead of following standard procedures, he rolled into a steep diving attack directly toward the lead bomber. The approach worked exactly as Johnson had calculated. The German bomber crews, focused on their target and watching for rear attacks, failed to detect the diving Spitfire until too late. Johnson opened fire at 400 yards and held the trigger for 3 seconds. His 8 machine guns delivered over 200 rounds directly into the Dornier's nose section and cockpit area. The effect was catastrophic. The bomber's port engine caught fire immediately. The aircraft's nose pitched down violently as the pilot lost control. Johnson pulled out of his dive just beneath the bomber formation and climbed away to safety. Behind him, the damaged Dornier spiraled toward the English Channel, trailing black smoke and debris. More importantly, the head-on attack had scattered the entire bomber formation. The remaining 7 aircraft broke formation to avoid collision with their damaged leader. Some turned away from their target. Others dove to lower altitude. The concentrated defensive fire pattern that protected standard bomber formations disappeared as individual aircraft maneuvered independently. Johnson's wingmen, following his lead, engaged the scattered bombers with conventional rear attacks. Without mutual defensive support, the individual German aircraft proved vulnerable to traditional fighter tactics. The section destroyed 2 additional bombers and damaged 3 others. The surviving German aircraft abandoned their mission and retreated toward France. The mission debriefing proved controversial. Squadron leader Lane criticized Johnson for breaking formation and ignoring tactical doctrine. Intelligence officers questioned whether the head-on approach could be replicated reliably. Several experienced pilots argued that Johnson had simply been lucky, and that attempting similar attacks would result in unnecessary casualties. Johnson defended his methods by citing results. 3 confirmed bomber destructions and 3 damaged aircraft represented exceptional success for a single-section engagement. The German formation had been completely disrupted and forced to abandon its mission. No British aircraft had sustained damage. The tactical innovation had achieved better results than standard approaches. Word of Johnson's unconventional tactics reached Fighter Command headquarters. Group Captain Trafford Lee Mallory, commanding No. 11 Group, ordered a detailed analysis of the engagement. Combat films from Johnson's aircraft confirmed the effectiveness of the head-on approach, but also highlighted the precision required for successful execution. Throughout winter 1941, Johnson refined his head-on attack technique through repeated practice and operational experience. Each bomber interception provided opportunities to test variations in approach angle, firing range, and escape maneuvers. Johnson maintained detailed notes on every engagement, analyzing what worked and what required improvement. The critical breakthrough came in understanding ammunition effectiveness. Johnson discovered that concentrated fire from 8 machine guns could achieve devastating results against bomber nose sections, which contained critical flight controls, navigation equipment, and crew positions. A 3-second burst delivered sufficient ammunition to disable even heavily constructed German bombers. Johnson also developed specific techniques for different bomber types. German Heinkel He-111 bombers required attacks against the nose section to disable the pilot and navigator. Dornier Do-2-17 aircraft were most vulnerable to engine attacks from slightly below center line. Junkers Ju-88 bombers, with their heavily armored crew compartments, required precise targeting of engine nacelles or wing root areas. By spring 1942, Johnson had achieved 15 confirmed victories, 12 of them against German bombers using head-on attacks. His success rate against bomber formations had improved dramatically compared to pilots using conventional tactics. Fighter Command headquarters began to take serious notice of his methods. In April 1942, Johnson received promotion to flight lieutenant and command of B Flight in No. 616 Squadron, a newly formed fighter squadron equipped with Spitfire Mark V aircraft. The posting provided Johnson with an opportunity to train other pilots in his tactical innovations and test whether the head-on approach could be taught systematically. Johnson's training methods emphasized individual combat skills over formation discipline. Pilots learned to approach bomber formations from multiple angles and altitudes. They practiced rapid target acquisition, deflection shooting, and collision avoidance. Most importantly, they learned to exploit the psychological advantages of unexpected attack directions. The training regimen Johnson developed was revolutionary for its time. Traditional fighter pilot instruction focused primarily on formation flying and disciplined adherence to prescribed attack patterns. Johnson's curriculum instead emphasized adaptability and individual decision-making under combat stress. Pilots spent hours in the cockpit practicing different approach angles against simulated bomber formations. Johnson utilized a specially modified Spitfire fitted with camera equipment to record training exercises. These films allowed detailed analysis of each pilot's technique, identifying specific areas for improvement. The visual feedback proved invaluable for developing the precise timing required for successful head-on attacks. Pilots could observe their own mistakes and understand exactly how small errors in approach angle or firing distance affected results. The psychological preparation was equally important. Johnson understood that head-on attacks required exceptional nerve and confidence. Pilots had to commit to an approach that appeared suicidal to observers. The natural human instinct was to turn away from an approaching bomber, rather than fly directly toward it. Johnson's training gradually built the mental resilience necessary to overcome these instincts. Mock combat exercises became increasingly sophisticated under Johnson's direction. He arranged for bomber aircraft from training units to participate in realistic interception scenarios. Fighter pilots practiced coordinating head-on attacks, while bomber crews learned to recognize and counter the new threat. These exercises provided valuable experience for both sides and helped refine tactical procedures. The technical aspects of head-on attacks required precise understanding of ballistics and aircraft performance. Johnson calculated optimal firing ranges for different approach speeds and angles. The Spitfire's 8 machine guns fired at a rate of approximately 1,000 rounds per minute each. A 3-second burst delivered roughly 400 rounds total, but only a fraction would hit the target unless fired from the correct position. Ammunition selection also proved critical. Johnson experimented with different combinations of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds to determine the most effective mix against German bomber construction. Armor-piercing ammunition penetrated engine blocks and vital components, while incendiary rounds started fires in fuel systems and hydraulic lines. The optimal combination varied depending on the specific bomber type being engaged. Johnson's technical innovations extended beyond basic attack techniques. He developed specific procedures for engaging bomber formations of different sizes and configurations. Small formations of 3 to 6 aircraft required different approaches than large formations of 12 or more bombers. German defensive tactics evolved throughout the war, forcing corresponding adaptations in British attack methods. The first major test of Johnson's training came during the Dieppe raid on August 19, 1942. Operation Jubilee involved a large-scale amphibious assault against the German-occupied port of Dieppe. The Royal Air Force committed over 60 squadrons to provide air cover for the landing forces, creating the largest air battle over Western Europe since the Battle of Britain. The complexity of the Dieppe operation provided an ideal testing ground for Johnson's tactical innovations. German bomber formations approached the invasion fleet from multiple directions throughout the day. Some attacked at high altitude to avoid anti-aircraft fire from naval vessels. Others attempted low-level approaches to achieve surprise. The varied attack profiles required flexible responses that traditional formation tactics could not provide. Johnson led No. 616 Squadron during multiple missions over Dieppe. The squadron flew 4 separate sorties during the 12-hour operation, engaging German aircraft on each mission. German bomber formations, attempting to attack the invasion fleet, provided numerous opportunities to employ head-on attack tactics. Johnson personally destroyed 3 German bombers during the day-long battle, while his squadron achieved exceptional success rates against bomber formations. The first engagement occurred at 0730 hours, as Johnson's squadron intercepted 8 Junkers Ju-88 dive bombers approaching the beach from the northeast. The German aircraft flew in loose formation at 12,000 feet, preparing to dive on British landing craft. Johnson positioned his squadron above the German formation and initiated a coordinated head-on attack. The attack sequence unfolded exactly as Johnson had trained his pilots. 4 Spitfires dove simultaneously toward the German formation from different angles. The lead Junkers exploded under Johnson's fire, its bomb load detonating and damaging 2 adjacent aircraft. The remaining German pilots scattered their formation and abandoned their attack runs. 3 additional bombers fell to Johnson's wingmen during the subsequent pursuit phase. The second engagement demonstrated the adaptability of Johnson's methods against different German tactics. At 11:15 hours, a formation of 12 Dornier Do-217 bombers approached at 22,000 feet, well above the altitude where traditional rear attacks proved effective. Johnson led his squadron in a climbing head-on attack that caught the German formation completely by surprise. The high-altitude engagement required modifications to standard head-on attack procedures. Thin air at 22,000 feet affected aircraft performance and pilot effectiveness. Johnson compensated by beginning his attack earlier and allowing for reduced maneuverability at altitude. The technique proved successful, with the squadron destroying 4 bombers and damaging 3 others without losing any British aircraft. More significantly, other pilots who had trained under Johnson began achieving similar results throughout the day. Flight Sergeant George Unwin, flying as Johnson's wingman, destroyed 2 Dornier Do 217 bombers using head-on approaches during separate engagements. His technique demonstrated the same precision and timing that characterized Johnson's attacks, proving that the methods could be taught and replicated reliably. Pilot Officer Robert Boyd, leading a section independently, scattered a formation of Junkers Ju-88 dive bombers with a single head-on attack that destroyed the lead aircraft. The Dieppe operations proved that Johnson's techniques could be taught and replicated by other pilots. Success was not dependent on exceptional individual skill, but rather on proper training and systematic application of proven methods. Fighter Command Headquarters finally acknowledged that head-on attacks represented a legitimate tactical innovation worthy of wider adoption. In October 1942, Fighter Command issued revised tactical instructions that officially authorized head-on attacks against bomber formations under specific circumstances. The directive specified that such attacks should only be attempted by experienced pilots against isolated bomber formations. Formation leaders were granted discretion to employ alternative attack methods when conditions favored such approaches. Johnson received promotion to squadron leader and command of No. 616 Squadron in January 1943. The promotion recognized both his personal combat achievements and his contribution to tactical development. Johnson now had the authority to implement his training methods across an entire squadron and influence fighter command doctrine directly. Throughout 1943, as Allied bomber formations began mounting daylight raids against German industrial targets, Luftwaffe bomber formations increasingly attempted retaliatory strikes against British installations. These raids provided Johnson and his squadron with numerous opportunities to practice and refine head-on attack techniques against different types of German aircraft. Johnson's personal victory count continued climbing. By summer 1943, he had achieved 28 confirmed victories, making him one of the Royal Air Force's most successful fighter pilots. His reputation as a bomber specialist had spread throughout Fighter Command. Other squadron commanders requested transfers for their best pilots to train under Johnson's methods. The culminating engagement occurred on September 14, 1943, during a German bombing raid against London. Intelligence reported a formation of 16 Dornier Do 217 bombers approaching from the southeast, escorted by approximately 30 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. Fighter Command committed 8 squadrons to intercept the raid. Johnson led No. 616 Squadron as part of the interception force. His squadron was assigned to engage the bomber formation, while other squadrons dealt with the fighter escort. Johnson positioned his aircraft at 28,000 feet, 4,000 feet above the approaching German formation, and waited for the optimal attack opportunity. As the German formation approached the Thames estuary, Johnson ordered his squadron to attack. Using the head-on approach he had perfected over 2 years of combat, Johnson rolled into a steep diving attack toward the lead bomber. His wingmen followed, targeting individual aircraft within the formation. The squadron attacked from multiple angles simultaneously, creating maximum disruption. Johnson's attack achieved textbook results. His 8 machine guns concentrated fire on the lead bomber's nose section for exactly 3 seconds. The Dornier's port engine exploded immediately. The aircraft rolled inverted and began its death dive toward the North Sea. Johnson pulled out beneath the formation and climbed away as his squadron mates pressed their own attacks. The squadron destroyed 6 bombers and damaged 4 others within 5 minutes of initial contact. The surviving German aircraft abandoned their mission and retreated toward occupied Europe. No British fighters sustained damage. The engagement represented the ultimate validation of Johnson's tactical innovations and training methods. Johnson's 34th victory, achieved during this engagement, marked the peak of his combat career. He had become the highest-scoring British fighter pilot of World War II, surpassing legendary figures like Douglas Bader and Adolphe Malan. More importantly, his tactical innovations had been adopted throughout fighter command and were being taught to new pilots as standard procedures. The strategic impact of Johnson's innovations extended far beyond individual combat success. By 1944, German bomber formations approaching British targets faced the certainty of head-on attacks from experienced Royal Air Force pilots. Luftwaffe bomber crews, previously confident in their defensive formations, now faced unpredictable attack patterns that scattered formations and exposed individual aircraft. German bomber losses over Britain increased dramatically throughout 1943 and 1944. Luftwaffe tactical reports acknowledged that British fighters had developed new attack methods that rendered traditional defensive formations less effective. German bomber operations against British targets decreased in frequency and effectiveness as crews became increasingly reluctant to face the enhanced fighter threat. The German response to British head-on attacks evolved through several phases. Initially, Luftwaffe bomber crews attempted to counter the new threat by increasing forward-firing armament. Some Dornier Do 217 aircraft received additional machine guns mounted in the nose section. Heinkel He-111 bombers were modified with reinforced cockpit armor to protect pilots and navigators from frontal attacks. These defensive modifications proved only partially effective. Additional armament increased aircraft weight and reduced performance, making bombers more vulnerable to conventional fighter attacks. Reinforced armor protected crew members but did nothing to prevent engine damage or structural failures caused by concentrated machine gun fire. German bomber crews remained vulnerable to head-on attacks despite these defensive improvements. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine underwent more significant changes as the threat became apparent. Bomber formations began flying more dispersed patterns that made coordinated head-on attacks more difficult. German pilots received training in evasive maneuvers designed to counter frontal approaches. Some formations adopted layered altitude deployments that forced British fighters to engage multiple targets simultaneously. The psychological impact on German bomber crews proved more significant than physical modifications or tactical changes. Luftwaffe aircrew had entered the war confident in their aircraft's defensive capabilities and their own tactical superiority. The emergence of effective British head-on attacks shattered this confidence and introduced new uncertainties into every mission over enemy territory. German bomber crews began reporting increased stress and fatigue during missions over Britain. The constant threat of unexpected frontal attacks meant that air crews could never relax their vigilance. Traditional tactics had allowed bomber formations to concentrate defensive fire against predictable rear attacks. Head-on approaches could come from any direction at any time, requiring constant alertness that exhausted crews during long missions. Luftwaffe mission reports from this period document declining morale among bomber crews assigned to operations over Britain. Many experienced air crews requested transfers to other theaters where they would not face the enhanced British fighter threat. Replacement crews arrived with limited experience and high anxiety about facing British fighters employing the new tactics. The strategic implications extended beyond individual bomber losses. German bombing operations against British targets required increasingly large escort formations to provide adequate protection. Fighter aircraft assigned to bomber escort duty could not be used for other missions, reducing German air superiority capabilities throughout Western Europe. The resource allocation forced difficult choices between offensive and defensive priorities. The psychological impact proved equally significant. British fighter pilots gained confidence that bomber formations could be engaged and defeated rather than merely harassed. Aggressive pursuit of German bombers became standard practice throughout fighter command. The defensive mentality that had characterized early war operations gave way to offensive tactics that prioritized bomber destruction over formation preservation. Johnson's training methods spread beyond fighter command to other Royal Air Force commands and Allied air forces. American fighter pilots adopted similar head-on attack techniques against German bomber formations during daylight raids over Europe. Commonwealth air forces integrated the methods into their training curricula. The tactical innovation influenced fighter operations throughout the European theater. In March 1944, Johnson received promotion to Wing Commander and Command of the Kenly Wing, comprising 3 fighter squadrons equipped with the latest Spitfire Mark 9 aircraft. The posting recognized his tactical expertise and leadership abilities. Johnson now influenced fighter operations across multiple squadrons and continued developing advanced combat techniques. Johnson's final combat tour occurred during the Normandy invasion and subsequent operations in Western Europe. Leading the Kenly Wing during ground attack and air superiority missions, Johnson adapted his head-on attack techniques for engaging German fighters and fighter bombers. His total victory count reached 38 confirmed destructions, making him the highest-scoring British pilot of the war. The Normandy campaign presented new challenges that required further tactical innovation. German fighter bombers, particularly the Focke-Wulf FW-190, employed hit-and-run tactics against Allied ground forces. These aircraft approached targets at high speed and low altitude, making interception difficult using conventional methods. Johnson developed modified head-on approaches specifically designed to counter these tactics. The technique involved positioning British fighters along likely German approach routes and attacking from unexpected angles as enemy aircraft committed to their attack runs. Johnson's pilots learned to anticipate German tactics and position themselves for optimal interception opportunities. The method proved highly effective against German fighter bombers, which were vulnerable during their attack approaches. During operations over France, Johnson's wing encountered increasingly sophisticated German defensive measures. Luftwaffe fighters began employing coordinated tactics designed to counter British head-on attacks. German pilots would work in pairs, with one aircraft serving as bait, while the second positioned for a counterattack against British fighters committed to frontal approaches. Johnson adapted his methods to counter these evolving threats. He developed multi-layered attack formations that provided mutual support during head-on approaches. British fighters would attack in sequence, with subsequent waves positioned to engage German aircraft attempting to counter the initial assault. The tactical evolution demonstrated Johnson's continued innovation throughout his combat career. The ground attack role also required modifications to standard air-to-air techniques. Johnson's pilots learned to engage German aircraft defending ground targets while avoiding anti-aircraft fire from surface positions. The complex tactical environment demanded exceptional situational awareness and precise timing. Johnson's emphasis on individual initiative proved crucial for success in these challenging conditions. On September 25, 1944, Johnson flew his final combat mission over the Netherlands. Leading a fighter sweep against German airfields near Utrecht, his formation encountered a mixed group of German fighters attempting to intercept Allied bombers. The engagement lasted 15 minutes and resulted in 3 confirmed German aircraft destroyed, including Johnson's final victory. During the combat, Johnson's Spitfire suffered engine failure due to combat damage from German defensive fire. The Merlin engine lost oil pressure and began overheating rapidly. Johnson executed a controlled forced landing in Allied-controlled territory near Eindhoven, where advancing British ground forces recovered him safely. The incident marked the end of his operational flying career. Fighter Command Headquarters determined that Johnson's combat tour was complete after reviewing his operational record. Having flown over 700 combat sorties and achieved 38 confirmed victories without being shot down, Johnson had exceeded normal tour lengths by a significant margin. Medical examinations revealed the cumulative effects of prolonged combat stress, making continued operations inadvisable. Johnson's transition to non-operational duties included assignments to fighter training establishments, where he continued developing tactical doctrine for jet aircraft. The emergence of jet fighters during the war's final months presented new challenges that required adaptation of existing tactical principles. Johnson's experience with high-speed combat proved valuable for understanding jet fighter capabilities and limitations. Post-war analysis revealed the full extent of Johnson's tactical contribution. Royal Air Force bomber interception success rates improved by over 40% after adoption of head-on attack techniques. German bomber losses over Britain increased correspondingly. Fighter pilot casualties during bomber interceptions decreased as head-on attacks reduced exposure time to defensive fire. Johnson received numerous decorations recognizing his combat achievements and tactical innovations. The Distinguished Service Order with 2 bars acknowledged his sustained combat success. The Distinguished Flying Cross, with bar, recognized exceptional gallantry during specific engagements. Most significantly, Johnson received the Air Force Cross for his contribution to tactical development and pilot training. After the war, Johnson remained in the Royal Air Force and commanded fighter squadrons during the early jet age. He adapted his tactical principles to jet aircraft operations and influenced the development of post-war fighter doctrine. Johnson retired from the Royal Air Force in 1966 with the rank of Air Vice Marshal, having served for over 25 years. The legacy of Johnson's innovations extended throughout the jet age and into modern aerial warfare. Head-on attack principles influenced the development of beyond visual range missile engagements. The emphasis on individual combat skills over formation discipline became standard in fighter pilot training. Johnson's approach to tactical innovation through systematic analysis and testing became a model for military aviation development. The transition to jet aircraft during the late 1940s required significant adaptation of Johnson's tactical principles. Jet fighters operated at much higher speeds than propeller-driven aircraft, compressing engagement windows and requiring faster decision-making. However, the fundamental concepts of head-on attacks remained valid and were incorporated into early jet fighter training curricula. Johnson's post-war assignments included evaluation of experimental jet aircraft and development of appropriate tactics for these new platforms. The de Havilland Vampire and Gloster Meteor presented capabilities and limitations unknown during the propeller era. Johnson worked with aircraft manufacturers and test pilots to understand how head-on attack principles could be adapted for jet operations. The Korean War provided the first large-scale test of jet fighter tactics derived from Johnson's innovations. Royal Air Force pilots flying Gloster Meteors in ground attack roles employed modified head-on approaches against North Korean aircraft. American pilots in Lockheed F-80, Shooting Stars and Republic F-84 Thunderjets reported similar success using comparable techniques against Chinese MiG-15 fighters. The supersonic era brought additional challenges that required further tactical evolution. Aircraft operating at twice the speed of sound compressed engagement windows to fractions of seconds. Traditional visual identification became impossible at these speeds, necessitating radar-guided missile systems that executed head-on attacks automatically. Johnson's principles influenced the development of these systems throughout the 1950s and 60s. Modern fighter aircraft like the English Electric Lightning, and later the Panavia Tornado, incorporated design features specifically intended to optimize head-on engagement capabilities. Radar systems were positioned for maximum forward detection range. Missile armament was configured for frontal attacks. Even aircraft design emphasized forward-firing capability over traditional rear-hemisphere defensive armament. The psychological aspects of Johnson's tactical innovations remained relevant throughout the Cold War period. Pilot training emphasized aggressive individual action and willingness to challenge conventional approaches when evidence suggested alternatives. This mindset proved crucial during various international crises where quick thinking and tactical flexibility determined mission success. Johnson's influence extended beyond Royal Air Force operations to NATO standardization efforts. Allied air forces adopted common tactical procedures based partly on principles Johnson had developed during World War II. The standardization improved interoperability between different national air forces and ensured consistent training standards throughout the alliance. The space age brought new applications for Johnson's tactical principles. Early satellite interception concepts employed head-on approaches to maximize relative velocity and minimize engagement windows. Anti-satellite weapons developed during the 1970s and 80s utilized similar geometric principles that Johnson had pioneered against German bombers decades earlier. Johnson died on January 30, 2001, at age 84. His funeral at St. Clement Danes Church in London drew representatives from air forces throughout the world. The service celebrated not only his personal combat achievements, but also his lasting contribution to fighter tactics and pilot training. Johnson was buried with full military honors. In 2003, the Royal Air Force established the Johnson Memorial Flight at RAF Koningsby, featuring a restored Spitfire Mark IX painted in the markings Johnson flew during his most successful period. The aircraft participates in air shows and commemorative events throughout Britain, ensuring that Johnson's legacy remains visible to new generations of aviation enthusiasts. Modern fighter pilot training curricula include case studies of Johnson's tactical innovations. Military academies throughout the world study his methods as examples of effective tactical development under combat conditions. Johnson's emphasis on analyzing enemy weaknesses and developing counter-tactics remains relevant to contemporary aerial warfare. The aircraft Johnson flew, Spitfire Mark IX serial number EN398, was preserved after the war and underwent complete restoration in the 1990s. Currently displayed at the Imperial War Museum, Duxford, the aircraft bears the scoreboard markings documenting Johnson's 38 confirmed victories. Visitors can see the 8 machine guns that delivered the devastating firepower Johnson used to revolutionize bomber interception tactics. Recent analysis using modern combat simulation technology has validated Johnson's tactical innovations. Computer modeling confirms that head-on attacks against bomber formations provide optimal hit probability when executed properly. The approach maximizes damage potential while minimizing defensive fire exposure. Johnson's instinctive understanding of aerial combat geometry proved mathematically correct. Advanced computational fluid dynamics studies conducted in the 21st century have analyzed the aerodynamic factors that made Johnson's techniques so effective. The research revealed that bomber aircraft flying in formation created complex airflow patterns that affected defensive gunfire accuracy. Head-on attacks exploited these aerodynamic blind spots that Johnson had identified through practical experience rather than theoretical analysis. Modern ballistics calculations have confirmed the optimal firing ranges and approach angles Johnson developed through trial and error during combat operations. Supercomputer simulations demonstrate that his 3-second firing bursts delivered maximum ammunition effectiveness while minimizing collision risk. The mathematical validation of Johnson's methods has influenced contemporary air combat training and weapon system development. University research programs studying historical air combat tactics have identified Johnson's innovations as a case study in battlefield adaptation and tactical evolution. Military academies worldwide include his methods in curricula covering combat leadership and tactical innovation. The systematic approach Johnson used to develop and refine his techniques has become a model for contemporary military research and development programs. The International Air Power Symposium, held annually at various military institutions, regularly features presentations analyzing Johnson's tactical contributions. These academic studies examine both the immediate combat effectiveness of his methods and their long-term influence on air warfare doctrine. The research has contributed to better understanding of how tactical innovations spread through military organizations. Psychological studies of fighter-pilot performance have identified specific mental attributes that enabled Johnson's success. Research indicates that his ability to challenge established doctrine while maintaining operational discipline represented an optimal balance between innovation and military effectiveness. Modern pilot selection programs incorporate personality assessments designed to identify similar characteristics in contemporary candidates. The Johnson Institute for Tactical Innovation, established at the Royal Air Force College Cranwell in 2005, conducts ongoing research into combat adaptation and doctrine development. The institute studies historical examples of tactical innovation, including Johnson's head-on attack methods, to identify patterns and principles applicable to contemporary military challenges. Artificial intelligence systems developed for modern fighter aircraft incorporate decision-making algorithms based partly on Johnson's tactical principles. These systems analyze engagement geometry and enemy aircraft characteristics to recommend optimal attack approaches. The automated systems can execute head-on attacks with precision that exceeds human capabilities while incorporating the strategic thinking Johnson pioneered. International collaboration on fighter aircraft development has standardized many features originally derived from Johnson's innovations. NATO air forces operate aircraft with common tactical systems that facilitate coordinated head-on attacks against enemy formations. The standardization ensures that pilots from different nations can employ similar techniques when operating together during multinational exercises or combat operations. The broader significance of Johnson's achievements extends beyond tactical innovation to institutional change. Fighter Command's willingness to revise established doctrine based on combat experience demonstrated organizational adaptability that proved crucial to Allied victory. Johnson's story illustrates how individual initiative can influence large-scale military operations when supported by enlightened leadership. During his combat career, Johnson flew 715 operational sorties and achieved 38 confirmed victories without ever being shot down. His survival rate was exceptional among fighter pilots of his era. Johnson attributed his success to careful preparation, systematic training, and willingness to challenge conventional thinking when evidence suggested better approaches existed. The tactical revolution Johnson initiated influenced not only Royal Air Force operations, but also Luftwaffe defensive procedures. German bomber formations adopted new defensive measures specifically designed to counter head-on attacks. These included modified armament configurations, altered formation structures, and revised routing procedures. The tactical dialogue between opposing forces drove continuous innovation throughout the air war over Europe. Johnson's autobiography, Wing Leader, published in 1956, provided detailed insights into his tactical development and combat philosophy. The book became essential reading for fighter pilots throughout the Commonwealth and influenced fighter tactics for decades. Johnson's emphasis on aggressive individual action within disciplined organizational structures became a fundamental principle of modern air combat. In recognition of his contribution to Royal Air Force history, Johnson was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1965. The honor acknowledged not only his wartime achievements, but also his post-war service developing jet fighter tactics and training procedures. Johnson remained actively involved in aviation organizations throughout his retirement. The principles Johnson pioneered continue influencing modern aerial warfare. Contemporary fighter aircraft employ beyond visual range missiles that effectively execute head-on attacks at distances Johnson could never have imagined. The psychological advantages of unexpected attack directions remain relevant in an era of stealth technology and electronic warfare. Johnson's tactical legacy transcends the specific technologies of his time. James Edgar Johnson commanded fighters for 3 years during World War II. He achieved 38 confirmed victories using tactics that military doctrine had declared impossible. He transformed how fighter pilots engaged bomber formations throughout the Royal Air Force and Allied air forces. He demonstrated that individual innovation could influence strategic outcomes when supported by institutional flexibility. On September 14, 1943, at 28,000 feet above the North Sea, Johnson executed the head-on attack that had earned him recognition throughout Fighter Command as the ultimate bomber killer. The maneuver that violated every rule of aerial engagement had become his signature technique. The illegal approach had transformed into standard doctrine. Johnson's story represents more than individual combat success or tactical innovation. It demonstrates how challenging institutional assumptions can produce revolutionary improvements when supported by systematic analysis and persistent testing. The young pilot from Leicestershire, who was initially rejected as medically unfit, became the highest-scoring British fighter pilot of World War II through determination, innovation, and courage. The legacy lives in every fighter pilot who approaches combat with the understanding that conventional tactics represent starting points rather than final solutions. Johnson proved that aggressive individual action, properly executed within sound tactical frameworks, could achieve results that exceeded traditional expectations. The revolution he initiated influenced aerial warfare for generations beyond his own. That's how Bomber Killer Johnson's head-on attacks transformed Royal Air Force fighter tactics through combat innovation that validated a new approach, spread through demonstrated success, and influenced fighter operations throughout the war and beyond. The illegal maneuver became the standard that helped establish Allied air superiority over Europe and contributed to ultimate victory in the greatest conflict in human history.